Vegas. Sometimes she's here and sometimes she can't be found. Turn around. Sarah's off on a turnaround, flying, gambling fools to the Holy Land, Las Vegas. Sometimes she's here and sometimes she can't be found. Turn around. And Sarah's off, half hiding far above the clouds. How she flies, I know I gotta find her a place she can push her toes around. She needs a place where she can lounge and wear a gown in. Sarah, turn around, turn around. Sarah's off on a turnaround, flying, gambling fools to the Holy Land, Las Vegas. Sometimes she's here and sometimes she can't be found. Turn around. Sarah's off on a turnaround. Las Vegas, sometimes she's not around. Turn around. In any night, well, she's here halfway around the world. Oh, I could cry, and so I know I gotta pray for delays and for days till she's beside me. Oh, alone in her room, and her scattered clothes remind me, Sarah, please, Sarah.
Distinguished Mr. President, Honorable Lennart Meri's family, Excellencies, dear friends. This time, the Lennart Meri Conference is a construction site, both literally and in an abstract sense. Let's try to make the most of it. Europe and the whole international system are entering a new era. There is no way back to the old. During the coming days, we will talk a lot about Europe's power and strategy, the choices that Europe is making today will shape our fate in the coming decades. The previous time when the international system went through a major upheaval was when the Cold War ended. At that time, Estonia made crucial choices that seemed unrealistic to many external observers. And yet, they have served our country incredibly well. Now, the pillars of Estonia's and Europe's security, NATO, the European Union, international law, are under enormous pressure. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, occupied Crimea in 2014, and started the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western responses to these events were led by the United States, even if partly from behind. While Europeans were having sophisticated debates about the need to take more responsibility for themselves. I do hope we will have some sophisticated debates during the coming days, but for Europe, I think taking over responsibility is no longer a matter of choice. We either do it or Europe is doomed. We all know the story about the history of the European Union, how France and Germany chose economic integration in order to never fight bloody wars again against each other. European integration in its current shape started after the Second World War, with the aim to make sure that Europe's past will not become its future. Estonia, like most other Central and Eastern European countries, did not have that choice at the time. Although, as our former president Lennart Meri used to claim, Estonians are among the oldest Europeans, having lived here on this land for 5,000 years. Well, maybe he exaggerated a little bit. Some more recent research suggests that it is only 4,500 years. But when we got the opportunity to choose Europe again when the Cold War ended, we wanted to make sure, like the French and Germans, that our past will not become our future. We returned to Europe in order to never be occupied again. For Ukrainians, choosing Europe is also about making sure that their past will not become their future, that they will never again be forced under the Russian sphere of influence, with the very existence of their nation being denied and destroyed. So, amidst all the turbulence, there is continuity in the European story, but only if there is also change. Europe needs more hard power to back up its soft power, and perhaps even more importantly, it needs to change its narratives and mental maps. And we need Ukraine on our side to keep Europe free. Of course, we are not here to talk only about Europe and the transatlantic relationship. There is faster development and more optimism about the future in some other corners of the world than the old West. We need to look towards the Indo-Pacific and Africa to re-energize our old continent. Globalization may have slowed down or even reversed in some respects, but events in faraway places continue to affect our lives, for better and for worse. Let me just mention the Strait of Hormuz or Taiwan. So on all of these issues, I wish you good discussions during the coming days. Let's be brave and open-minded as we look to the future, since fortune favors the brave. So to conclude, let me warmly thank everyone who has contributed to this year's conference, our partners, our sponsors, and of course the wonderful team at the ICDS, and especially the director of the Lennart Meri Conference, Eda Ahi. And let me now hand over to Terry Schultz, who will moderate the first panel. Terry, please.
They don't invite me here to behave, Baiba. Yeah, you said that. And then I said, here, you there. Thank you very much, Christy. And I would just echo my thanks to Eda and to the staff who organize everything and get us all here and into this room and make everything happen. My name's Terry Schultz. I've been covering the EU and NATO for as long as anybody can remember, a couple of decades, and Estonia in particular since 1989. And that's why I'm always so privileged to be here and grateful to be invited, especially today for this very high-pressure position to be opening the Lennart Meri Conference this year with our panel, Bridge Over Troubled Water. I would like to welcome those of you joining us online, and to any first-timers here at LMC, you are in for a treat. One of the hallmarks of this conference is that we speak very openly and candidly, respectfully among friends. Everybody here knows a lot about what's happening in the world and cares a lot about what's happening in the world, and that's what makes LMC such a special event. So I'm going to introduce those people joining me on stage. Everybody will know our host, Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michal, Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama, Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the State Department, Tom Dinano, Boris Ruge, Ambassador, NATO Ambassador for Political Affairs and Security Policy, and Dr. Jana Puglierin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks to all of you for being with me. We are both fortunate and brave to be kicking everything off here. So the title of this panel is interesting, Bridge Over Troubled Water, the next chapter in transatlantic cooperation. So you can see they spun it at the end with a bit of positivity, cooperation, not just the neutral relations. But in thinking about this and what this theme means, it occurred to me that we are often talking about the troubled water, and Christy laid that out, so we don't need to go through all the reasons why the water is troubled. But more than in any time since, at least since I've covered the Alliance, it's the bridge that we're talking about. It's the bridge that we're worried about. It's no longer this indestructible iron path that connects Europe and the United States. And we talk more about that perhaps right now than about the problems in the water. And that's what we're going to discuss today, or perhaps try to reassure each other that we don't need to worry about it so much. And that's where I'm going to start with the Prime Minister. Thinking about this just this morning, some people coming through Helsinki to get here were disturbed by yet another incident that the Baltic states, and Estonia in particular, has been suffering. Possible drones in the airspace. Now, that might have been something that we didn't worry about so much 10 years ago, but now everybody is so on edge. You've got fighter jets scrambled into the air. You've got people told to stay in their homes. Everybody's nerves are on edge, Prime Minister. So give us the lay of the land here in our host country, in Estonia. Estonians are among the most fervent NATO supporters, transatlantic allies. Are they feeling that emotion reciprocated, that devotion reciprocated right now?
I would say for sure, yeah, that Estonians support NATO. The support to NATO is high, something between 70 to 80. So it's in Estonia, it's high support. Usually in Estonia, there's not customary to be very optimistic about anything. But with NATO, we are. That is the first thing. And I have some practical experiences also, because every prime minister has his time or her time. And at the end of 24, we had this kind of program running that Baltic countries were desyncing themselves from Russian energy grid. And at the same time, Russian shadow fleet hit a few of cables on the sea between us and Finland. So a little bit after that, I called NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Alex Stubb did the same. Our military guys interacted, and Baltic Sentry is right now, as you're flying from the Baltic Sea, you can see the military ships on the sea. This is Baltic Sentry. NATO is working. And in September last year, we had similar instance, for example, that Russian MiGs were in our airspace. Italian F-35s, most modern the planes they are, went up and diverted them. And so I would say that from the practical side, NATO works absolutely well. It's like a Swiss watch, very expensive, but works.
But reliable.
Yeah.
But what I actually asked about is whether Estonians feel it, and you actually responded to the practical side. People are worried here. You can't pretend they're not.
Yeah, but probably if you look at social polls, I would say the first worry probably is right now even not the security so much. It used to be. And when the drones hit some objects in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or in Finland and so on, the worry arises again. But I would say that this kind of investment and commitment also to security, because Estonia has this year's budget is 5.4% of GDP to defense. I would say it gives the message that we take everything related to our security and defense very seriously. Our allies in Baltics, Nordics, in different countries also have the same attitude. So, and on the practical side, as I explained, that I'm not talking about theory. I know how it in practice works. So if we set aside the political rhetorics, this military side of NATO works exactly as it should.
So he answered the same way exactly again. So my conclusion is that Prime Minister Michal has no emotion.
You can try me again.
I have to give time to Edi Rama because we know why.
Yeah.
Okay, Prime Minister Rama.
Why?
We've joked because we've already had the joke that he said if we didn't want him to talk long, he shouldn't have been invited, and we very much want him here. So
no, I didn't say that.
How did you put it? How did you put it?
Instead of dealing with you, I want to
I already knew you were going to do things like that
make
too.
the best out of the short time you gave me. First of all, I want to thank the Prime Minister for giving me the opportunity to finally visit this country and this city,
Is it your
which
first
I
time?
find wonderful. Yeah, it's my
Nice.
first time.
Oh, wow. Congratulations. It's a nice city.
And I discovered that food is great here, which I didn't expect. And on the other hand, I made sure to bring sun here. I see that now I'm going to leave. It's dark again, but sorry, my
Only
friend.
6 months. So.
Sorry, my friend.
Yeah.
I can't stay here longer. So, what was your question?
So
Because you didn't make a question.
No, it's true.
You
It's
just
true.
made a characterization of myself. So,
I was.
and I didn't say
that was my lead-up.
I didn't say you should not invite me. I said, if you want people to speak shortly, don't invite a man from the Balkans.
Okay.
It's a different thing.
I'm sorry, I incorrectly attributed you to be speaking about yourself. But my question to you is further away from the Russian front line, the sort of existential crisis that the Baltic states, the Nordic states feel every day. What is the sentiment about NATO? How are you looking towards NATO 3.0 in Albania? Again, a strong pro-Atlanticist country, traditionally very pro-NATO. Is there anything that is shaking the Albanians' faith right now in the solidarity of the alliance, or do they feel like everything's fine?
Listen, Albanians are Western Talibans, so
What does that mean?
we are with the transatlantic alliance all the way, whatever it takes. And by whatever it takes, I want to start, because yesterday I had the honor to be in a very beautiful ceremony in Germany where they honored Mario Draghi with the Charlemagne Prize. And he made a speech which made me think about the fact that it's already 2 years since his report about Europe. And while the speech was more or less deepening in the same, what has happened in terms of acting is not that much. And this is what is the basis of the main worry, if we can talk about worries. And I don't want to provoke anyone here, but I'm very tempted to make, not a parallel, but just to make a starting point from the Soviet Union in terms of things being understood, being perceived in a way or in another, but not being addressed. And this is tempting, not because Europe can become the USSR, but it's tempting because there is a fundamental question to answer. Could Europe, under certain conditions, allow defense imperatives, geopolitical anxiety, and fragmented political responses to create a long-term imbalance between security ambition and what I would call civilizational resilience, which, on other words, mean that we are facing a risk that security burden can distort economic priorities. Perceived strategic inferiority can trigger an overreaction. And then what is the most dramatic part of it, talking about the NATO 3.0 or whatever you call it, is that bureaucratic fragmentation weakens the response, which then brings to another point that deserves at least attention and discussion, which is that political legitimacy is undermined by the search for military strength, right? So all these things make me worried in the sense of where Europe is going, because instead of blaming and trying to reassess our position by showing showing our finger towards the United States or to President Trump, we need to make a real assessment and try to realize that the context, of course, has changed, but what the real answer will be. Because I don't think that the real answer is to just launch ourselves in an overspending and not address the structural problem we have, because we are many nations, together we are a big economy. But when it comes then to the whole way we have to act and have to harmonize, then we are not anymore what we look when we are seen like a arithmetically sum of our GDPs. So I will conclude, to your surprise, with a question. which Europe, I think, has to ask, and is how much can a civilization spend to secure itself without weakening the foundations that make it worth securing? Because we know very well that there are so many complex tasks and challenges that we need to address in parallel. And as Mario Draghi said yesterday, we have to reflect on a simple fact that we don't have barriers with the world, and we suddenly are shocked that there are some tariffs, but we have still a lot of barriers within our own perimeter, which makes us not as strong as we want to appear when it comes then to act in the direction you wanted me to answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think that Baltic leaders will want to talk about that because their societal resilience is very much tied up in their security. They're 5% countries, and I am not a panelist, so I am not going to talk about this any further. But I think we can have discussion about that because those are very relevant questions in these societies that have already raised their defense spending to 5% and have very much whole of society approaches to this. But again, I'm going to stop and hand it over to Tom Donato. And now you have to be funny, too, after all of this. Sorry, Tom. Speaking with you, you've been on a tour of European states now. You've been in Poland. You were at the B9 summit. So you've had some good, I would presume, conversations, honest, open, candid conversations with your European partners and interlocutors. So tell us how that's been going. How have your discussions with them been? Have they seemed to understand what the Trump administration is wanting from them and what you are willing to offer them in return? And did you get a feeling that things are on a better track than they sometimes look from the headlines that people like me write?
First of all, thanks, Mr. Prime Minister, for hosting me. It's my first time in Estonia, and towns as beautiful as advertised. And also thank you to the Mary Conference for having me as well. I'd be remiss before I answered your question and not talking about the U.S. delegation here. We also, in addition to my presence, there's 4 bilateral ambassadors sitting out here in the crowd. And if that's doesn't tell you about U.S. commitment to the region, I don't know what does. So that's number one. Number two, I've had terrific engagements. And this part of the world, they're honest and they're frank and they're open. And they were exactly that. I thought the B9, I was there as an observer. U.S. has been an observer there since 2015. I thought the statement they put out was terrific. We had perfect alignment. Again, there's always some back and forth in these documents that we produce. But certainly, hearing from the principals at that meeting, I saw tremendous alignment. We talked a lot about NATO 3.0. And look, this is my second sort of turn in the Trump administration. I really think this second term is really an extension in a lot of ways of his first term. In his first term, we talked a lot about this notion of America first, but not America alone. And that couldn't be more true today. Obviously, we've made some changes. I think everyone here is familiar with the national security strategy, the national defense strategy. And there's some of these frank conversations weren't easy, but we're not going anywhere. You'll probably continue to see some changes, but we're going to do it in lockstep with our partners. And there's been terrific efforts in this part of the world on meeting the NATO, the 5.0 spend. Ambassador Whitaker and his team have been terrific in Brussels. But I think the important concept behind 3.0 is taking this notion of spend and turning it into capabilities. And I don't think anything has shined a light on it more than what we've seen happen with the events in the Gulf. The sense of urgency is palpable. And every single, both bilateral and I think it was 17 nations at the B9 reiterated that. So again, this has been a terrific trip. It's not my first time to the region, and it won't be my last. So thank you.
Just to follow up on that, you were there when the surprise announcement about the Polish rotational troops came out. Did it surprise you, or did you?
I don't think it should surprise anyone that there are forced posture changes in Europe. How it happens, look, sometimes the coordination may need to be better, but it was right there in black and white. Looking, sometimes things are on paper, and when they actually start to happen, it can be a little bit shocking. But again, the U.S. isn't going anywhere. I know the chairman will be here. My counterpart and good friend Alison Hooker was here last week. I'm here. Again, our team here in the region are all here to stand shoulder to shoulder. None of this is going to be easy. It's not easy. Again, some of these conversations weren't easy, but they were direct, they were frank, and that's the only way you can be to be true partners and friends, is to be honest with each other, and we'll keep working at it and get better where we need to.
But 5% doesn't save you from getting troops not rotated to your country, because Poland is...
There's other panelists here.
I know, but I got you. I sat you next to me for a reason.
What was your question?
5%, I mean, some countries think that by spending what the Trump administration and what NATO has agreed to might mean that they're not going to be the target of some of these reductions.
Yeah, I don't think it's certainly sort of a if this, then that, right? The force posture changers, I would defer to the Pentagon, the European Command, the Operational Command. Of course, our job at the State Department is to maintain open channels with both the bilateral government as well as multilateral organizations such as NATO. But look, the president's been pretty clear on this. Secretary Rubio's been pretty clear on this. And Ambassador Whitaker has been, he's been at this now for a while. The spending is one thing, trying to bring it to life. Again, understanding all the challenges we're having in the defense industrial base, and I can talk maybe a little bit more about that later. Again, none of this is going to be easy. And again, if we'll continue to work with the Pentagon and work with our partners to make sure we get the right fit and the right mix of what's happening here on the ground.
All right, I will let Boris take over now, and that's a good lead-in to NATO.
Many thanks, Terry.
Yeah.
It's very nice to be back at
I didn't ask you
Mary.
anything yet, though, Boris. So
Were you going to ask me something?
No, I mean, it is easy. You do good. I mean, I did want to talk about how these changes, how these sort of the conversations are unfolding there at NATO headquarters, where you are.
We'll talk about that.
Not just
but maybe
these
I can
changes.
say a few words.
You may.
Just to start off. And what I wanted to start by was saying that I beat you to Tallinn, because I was here in 1988, and I attended a meeting of an organization at the time that was called Rahvarinna. I'm sure my pronunciation is not very good, but it was an organization that was dedicated to preserving Estonia's identity, cultural identity.
Which was a risk back then. It was dangerous.
Yeah, sure. And it was
I see friends in the room who were
1988,
there. 1988.
And of course, within 3 years, Estonia was independent, and that, I think, is still something that is quite amazing.
Independent again. You had to learn that.
Independent again.
I learned that one.
So I've great admiration for Estonia and its people, and my personal feelings aside, we at NATO have great respect for what Estonia has been doing, for the seriousness and the determination that it brings to fulfilling its commitments to the alliance. That's very important to us. This year, as we know, Estonia will be somewhere at or above 5% of GDP, and that's on core defense spending. So that's important, very remarkable. In this uncertain world that we've already talked about a little bit, NATO remains the guarantor of our security, but going forward, it is not going to be your dad's NATO. It's going to be a different NATO. It's going to be NATO in which Europe takes on a much greater share of the burden and more responsibility. For NATO to be strong, to remain strong, it needs to become more European, in the words of Mark Rutte, that you've already, I think, heard, Terry. What we need is a stronger Europe and a stronger NATO. Last year alone, European allies and Canada increased defense spending by 20% compared to 2024. So that's a massive increase in defense spending. That amounts to approximately 100 billion euros. NATO is present here in Estonia, including British and French troops. We have the German brigade that is being built in Lithuania. We have Canadians in large numbers in Latvia. European allies have assumed leading roles to secure the eastern flank, the Baltic Sea, and the Arctic. And when Russian MiGs, as was mentioned by the Prime Minister, crossed into Estonian airspace last fall, it was European fighter jets from Italy, Sweden, and Finland that dealt with that situation. I think that gives you a kind of sense. So, of course, the US remains key to European security, no doubt, from extended deterrence to high-end conventional capabilities, but European allies are stepping up in a big way. Speaking here in Tallinn, let me state the blindingly obvious, which is NATO is a powerful alliance, and we are fully capable of deterring and defending. And if push came to shove, we will defend every inch of Allied territory right here. And as Mark Rutte has said, and I'll quote him again, any attack on a NATO ally would be met with a devastating response. I think it's just important to put that down. As for the Ankara summit, which is less than 2 months away, we'll be laser focused on delivering what Allied leaders agreed to in The Hague last year. First, allies must show tangible progress towards the combined 5% of the Hague Defence Investment Plan. Second, we must strengthen our defense industrial base. It's a difficult thing to do, both in North America and in Europe. We're not where we'd like to be. And finally, and very importantly, we must sustain strong support to Ukraine, understanding, as we all do, that Ukraine's security is inextricably linked to our own. So in closing, let me acknowledge once again that Estonia is top of the class, both in terms of its commitment to deterrence and defense and in its support to Ukraine. We would be happy to have more allies like Estonia, but rest assured that NATO, for its part, will hold up its end of the bargain.
All right, thank you. Now, Jana, it's open for you to pick up on any lines that you've heard here so far, and also maybe what I find happens in discussions about NATO these days is we talk so much about these things that we do forget a bit about Ukraine. As Boris brought up, we need to remember that one of the reasons why everyone in Europe needs to do this is so that to help Ukraine in addition to their own self-defense. So maybe you can pick this up. I mean, you write about these things all the time. So basically pick your favorite column and share it with us.
Thank you, Terry. So I was here several times already. I love this conference. I learn a great deal, and I hope I get re-invited. I'm the only non-prime minister, non-governmental official on this panel. I'll use this opportunity for being a little candid and for giving you something to chew on. And I hope, as I said, I want to get re-invited, please. First, I think we are facing a somewhat very paradoxical situation in NATO right now. And I want to come back to something that Estonian Prime Minister has said initially when he was talking about the military reality in NATO and comparing it to a Swiss clock. And I think this is absolutely adequate. I think the American Secure is doing a great job. We have a lot of very committed US soldiers, US civil servants doing their job in NATO all over the place. We have 84,000 US troops still in Europe. We have the US providing the bulk of operational strength. We just see this kind of military exercise unfolding, Spring Storm 2026, with American participation. So all seems to be fine. But this is kind of basically one reality. This is the military and NATO reality. But then there is a different reality, and you bypass this, Prime Minister, by saying, yeah, there's political talk. But I think it's more than that. I mean, we have a political reality in the White House where we have a US president actually threatening to annex the sovereign territory of one of its most devoted allies, looking at Greenland and Denmark. We have a US president who says openly NATO is a paper tiger and Putin knows it. We have a US administration that perceives the EU as a foe and threatens it with tariffs. And we have a lot of decisions that have been taken in the United States without consulting European allies that deeply affect European allies. Talking about the 28-point plan on Ukraine, I don't know if you have forgotten about this, but please remember the troop withdrawal now kind of 5,000 in Germany, 4,000 in Poland, which I think we need to accept. There is no legitimate right to expect American soldiers being present in Europe. I think we should all remember this. alliance as Europeans, but it is a challenge for us. And also, I think from a German perspective, I have to say that what worried me most, looking at recent announcements, was the decision on the multi-domain task force not being basically deployed to Germany. So I think when I look at NATO, I see some Schrödinger's NATO, if you know what I mean. So basically, the US is in and out of NATO at the same time, and we don't know really what the state of NATO is until we open the box. But I think that might be too late then. I also want to point at one, I think, deep problem that we are having in NATO currently, and that is that the European part of the alliance thinks that Russia is a long-term threat to Europe and the Euro-Atlantic security space, and it's our most acute, most urgent, most worrying threat. And the Europeans managed to squeeze this in the summit declaration in The Hague, long-term threat posed by Russia to Euro-Atlantic security. But when I read recent US documents, they talk about a manageable but persistent threat to NATO's eastern flank. And how I read this is pretty clear. So Russia is a regional threat to Europe and should be managed by Europe. It's not a threat to the US directly, and there is no longer a sense of this joint Euro-Atlantic security space. So basically, I think the US is no longer seeing itself as a European power the way it did for a very long time. On a bad day, the US, under Trump, thinks it could be a mediator between NATO and Europe, coming back to the 28-point plan. I think it's not everybody in the United States who thinks like that. There are still a lot of people very committed to NATO, to the alliance, but it's not the people now sitting in the White House. And I think that is an actual problem for us, and we cannot just paper this over. And that's why I conclude that, Boris, you're totally right. The Europeans need to step up, need to become stronger. And I don't want to, talk about the end of NATO. I think NATO is alive and kicking, but it needs to become more European-led. And it's not only about spending more, it's really that kind of the Europeans need to step up. They need to own parts of the command and control structure. They need to provide the strategic enablers, and they need to also show more leadership. And I think you said the US remains key. I think the challenge is that the US needs to become less key, because I think we cannot rule out a situation where NATO is challenged and we don't have unanimity in NATO about Article 5, and the Europeans need to have a discussion what then and who will fight with whom in this circumstance.
I guess you get invited back if the audience is to decide. Tom Dodano, just quickly, does Jana have the right read that the United States no longer considers Russia a threat?
I'd encourage her to read our national security strategy and our national defense strategy. Again, I think
I just quoted from the strategy: manageable but persistent threat to NATO's eastern flank.
As I was saying, look, I think.
Yeah.
First of all, having sat with 7 heads of state last 2 or 3 days ago, that is the message that I received on behalf of those governments could not have been stronger, more aligned, and supporting the notion that Europe does need to do more. The United States, again, very clear in our documents and our policy documents, is managing rising power in the East, right? President Trump just returning from China. And again, I would defer to the NATO Secretary General, incredibly positive, incredibly dynamic, who has been clear and direct that U.S. leadership is pivotal. It exists. Again, that's why I'm here. That's why we continue to maintain the force posture we do. And again, it should be no surprise. Again, hard to do, and how we do it's important as well. That there are force posture changes that are implementing the very strategy that we wrote about a year ago.
If there were arms control negotiations, you would be the negotiator, wouldn't you?
Well, ultimately the president makes the decisions.
But that would be part of your job, to negotiate a new start. If there were to.
Well, we can't have a new start. New start expired.
Right, but
we didn't withdraw from it. No, it's an important distinction. New start expired, right? The strategic weapons treaty bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia. And at the same time that it expired, President Trump called for a new treaty. So I think focusing on the expiration is one thing. To me, he didn't use the word treaty by accident. That's an extremely high bar in the United States, as we know, 2/3 of the Senate. The president wanted a new and better treaty. Again, New START was appropriate for the time, for 2010. It's not appropriate for 2026. I think everybody recognizes that. I know we're talking extensively this month at the NPT review conference, and there seems to be a lot of unanimity and agreement around that, not only the nuclear weapon states, but with some of the other countries that are, again, the non-aligned movement and some of the other very influential multilateral organizations. And of course, New START is only one small part of the arms control architecture, and we've talked about this going back to 2020, where I was part of the leadership of the New START renegotiation. And that's the Russian theater range systems that are a number in the thousands. The Russians talk about these capabilities almost daily. When talking about Ukraine, they need to be taken seriously, and they weren't covered by New START. We continue to have a serious problem with that. But thanks for raising that. Ultimately, who does that work, I'll let the president decide.
Okay, Levin. Boris, I know you want to come in, but I've been neglecting my prime ministers over here. I know. I hear your foot tapping. Prime Minister Michal, there's no question who the threat is to Estonia. So inside NATO, do you feel any difference, or do you feel that this is sort of any kind of problematic divide?
I would say that Trump has been quite consistent in his first term and second term, and saying that Europe is a free region, very wealthy one, should also contribute to burden sharing, which is understandable to us. And as Eddie pointed out, the question that how much can you contribute to security until it becomes too much of a burden to your economy and society. I don't know the exact figure, but Estonia, before we lost our independence, was about 30% or something like that, So I would say that contributing 5% of keeping us independent, having Lennart Meri conference here, probably would be not too much. That is the first thing. Second thing is that, as Boris pointed out, that Europe has already increased defense expenditure by almost 20%. So that means to the NATO that about one half comes from Europe and Canada, the second half comes from the States. So the burden sharing is already working. That probably will mean that Europe is stronger. Stronger Europe does not mean a bad thing for American partners. We are still allies and good allies. For example, Article 5 has been invoked only once by America's asking, so everybody was there. In Europe, we have also this kind of 42.7, which is also an article in European burden sharing, which also has been invoked only once by France. So that has happened also. So my answer would be that we understand the message that Europe has to take care of itself more, but American allies and partners are still there. And we can see American troops are also in Estonia in this kind of spring storm exercise right now. I have 3 sons, 2 of them are there right now. Third one is 8 years, so he doesn't take participating yet. But I trust that we have allies, and we have had good allies throughout different administrations.
Boris, I will come back. And is the perception different in Albania? Who are people worried about there if it's not the Russia threat that we feel here in the north?
Jana said that she's not prime minister and she's not official, so she can be candid. I'm not sure she meant that we were not candid.
That is what you make of it.
But yeah, of course.
Nobody gives her
but,
talking points, that's for sure.
But I want to say that when Trump was elected, he said that God had a plan and wanted to bring him back to the White House to save the United States. And it was then that I added that he said only half of the truth, because the God plan was that by electing Trump, God wanted to wake Europe up, right? So I don't understand really when Europeans consume time talking about what Trump said, what Trump said, what Trump said. I believe more the American friends when they say, take President Trump seriously, but not literally. So the serious part of that is that President Trump made Europe see itself in whole its weakness, right? So, speaking as Prime Minister of Albania, a country that is seeking to get in the European Union, and now a veteran among the leaders, I must say, I've heard so many times, we want you in Europe, we want you in Europe, we want you in Europe, but it never happened to make a step. And we needed Vladimir Putin to wake them up and to say, hey, the geopolitical thing is real. The geopolitical threat is real. It's not just some theoretical thing. So, on one hand, Putin helped Europe wake up and accelerate the process for us and in general. And on the other hand, Trump helped Europe to realize that it has to get its act together. Now, what I see as a problem is the total disconnection in our discussions between what we have to do militarily and what we have to do on all the rest. So, but this is connected. And I am very, very afraid that if this old defense expansion remains in this abstract percentage, you know, we have to increase 3%, 4%, 5%, and is not tied to, number one, industrial productivity and competitiveness in Europe. And then number two, procurement integration, which is another big problem. And then innovation overall, plus democratic legitimacy for Europe, not just for the elected governments. Then it's very possible that Europe will have more weapons, but will be weaker. So the political dimension is so important because, on the other hand, it's also an option that all this, you know, security anxiety can revive the dark forces that have been in Europe for long. And this is where we have to become very serious, because if rearmament and all this spending will occur alongside recession, inequality, migration panic, identity conflict, declining trust in the mainstream political parties, then Europe could witness, in the meantime, a much stronger far right, ethno-nationalism, and then neo-fascism can appear in its real, true colors. So I want to say that Europe's challenge is not merely just how to arm, how to have more soldiers, how to have more weapons, how to go up and up in spending, but it is to ensure that rearmament does not become a vessel for democratic destabilization. And this can be a real thing if we want to learn from history, because Europe has a history, and history has shown very much to us what we have to try and avoid. So we have kind of admired, and we have kind of adored Europe and the European Union as a great force for peace and for security. And we have always thought, wrongly so, that all the blood, all the conflict, all the ghosts and the dark forces are in the past. But suddenly we face a big strategic dilemma. And it's not enough to identify where are the problems. The big problem is how these problems are addressed when it comes to the competitive side, when it comes to the energy security. We live in a continent, as I said before, that is very strong when you arithmetically bring together the GDP, but that is horribly weak when you see how the energy market is so fragmented, and how energy costs far less in one point and far more in another point. So I think it can be a big trap, this if defense becomes self-consuming, and it can paradoxically make the feeling of anxiety and the feeling of insecurity and the feeling of being under some attack and the feeling of have to deal with an aggression in the coming years. And so we have to expand militarization, a trap to radicalize politics and to make strategic restraint more and more impossible. So let me finish that. On one hand, we have the high-risk path, which is fragmented military expansion. It's fragmented. Let's face it. Debt without productivity, social decline, and then, of course, nationalist opportunism that is always there ready to take over. So if we want to take the low-risk path of rearmament, because let's not forget, until some time ago, everyone was very enthusiastic about disarmament. Now we have an excitement about rearmament. So integrated defense modernization, industrial renewal, technological innovation, social investment, democratic resilience, these are the things that can somehow balance.
Okay,
otherwise,
Prime Minister, I'm
otherwise, then you'll be in a position to be asked to show before the questions and for the committee to approve before you moderate.
No, that won't happen.
I hope not.
Not here.
I hope not.
But because we also want to get to questions, because there are many people in this room who are policy leaders, also ministers who can.
You want
talk
to get
to
the question moderated?
I also want to get
moderated
questions.
Better.
You know what? Next time you're going to moderate, and I'm going to be a panel. Okay. Okay.
Why are you complaining to me?
I didn't complain. I just cut you off. Okay, so you guys, quick ones, because then, we've got a whole room full of smart people who want to talk.
So first, of course, I agree with Prime Minister Rama that we need a stronger defense industrial base, and that is part of our deterrence and defense posture. So we need to get there. And I also agree with the Prime Minister that we have to make the case for increased defense spending again and again. However, speaking as a German for 1 second, I think the predicament
in which you can't avoid,
Yeah, I can't avoid. The predicament in which we find ourselves now, I would say, as a German, as a citizen of Germany, is that we underspend on defense for so many years. That puts us in a position of vulnerability, and we must get out of that position. And that is, of course, precisely why we have the decisions that we took in The Hague. And very briefly, Terry, on the issue raised by Jana. So NATO is an alliance of 32 democracies, and we have different starting points. So the purpose of NATO is to bring allies together. And in The Hague, we indeed did agree that Russia was the long-term threat. Just a few weeks ago, as Tom knows, we prepared at NATO for the NPT review conference, and you can read our NAC statement, our North Atlantic Council statement, on these nuclear issues, where we have choice language on Russia as violating serially arms control agreements and engaging in reckless nuclear rhetoric and signaling. And I was in the GA hall speaking on behalf of NATO alongside Chris Yaw, Tom's colleague, and I think we're very clear that Russia is the problem and that we need to deal with that. So I think we do have a consensus that Russia is the problem, and the defense spending that we have agreed on, this massive increase, which of course is politically challenging, is of course motivated because we have Russia breathing down our neck.
Okay, Jana?
So I think it's a trap to put these two things against each other. So on the one hand, you have productivity and competitiveness, and or higher defense spending. And I think it is not an either or. I think it needs to be.
It should be together.
Yeah, it needs to be.
What I said.
It needs to be both. But I think the way you made the argument, we basically focus on, as you said, the militarization of Europe, and we're not looking enough at productivity. I think that's the wrong framing.
It's not me saying it, it's Mario Draghi saying it and repeating it again and again.
No,
and again.
but maybe you let me finish first before you repeat it again and again?
You were together before, and she encouraged us to interrupt each other. Is it true?
Nope.
No? Okay.
But I mean, I think your starting assumption is wrong, because when I look at polling data, and ECFR does a lot of polling and has asked this question to Europeans again and again, do we need to spend more on defense? And for years now, we've seen tremendous public support for higher defense spending and more capable European armies. So I think the citizen out there, and even the German citizen by now, is actually totally capable to understand that without security, everything is nothing. And that security is the basis for everything. And that means that we need to invest. And I think it's not about militarization, and it's not about a spending spree, because when you look at the history of the 3.5% goal, this is basically, if you think about the NATO regional plans and what needs to be done to deter NATO, this is basically capability-based. This is not a number out of the blue because we all of a sudden thought, oh, it would be great to spend so much on defense, but it's it's real needs that need to be fulfilled. So
based on NATO capability targets.
Sorry?
Based on NATO
capability targets. But of course, you are right. It's not about spending more. It's also about spending better, more collectively, procure together, reduce the numbers of weapon systems and all of this. But I think it is not about the militarization of Europe, how I see it.
Okay, I'm going to take a question.
But to make sure that I'm not taken out of context, I never said that we should not rearm and we should just make a naked party at the border with Russia. I said simply that the challenge for Europe is not whether it rearms. This is out of question. It is whether in rearming it will preserve the economic vitality, it will preserve the democratic legitimacy, it will preserve the social cohesion, and it will become what it should become in a world where the competitive global powers are emerging very strongly while Europe is lagging behind. And the last thing is what distinguishes militarized, I lived in a militarized country with something else that is the Europe we want. It's not the fact how much armed both are, but is what distinguishes a durable civilization from one that is gradually consumed by the costs of defending itself. The second one is the Soviet Union and others, and the first one I wish is Europe. So this is just to make it very clear, because you ask the citizens about rearming, but please ask them about healthcare, ask them about prices of energy, ask them about making startups in Germany, ask them about this, and then they'll say, yes, we want this, we want this, we want that. The problem is how to do both.
There are sacrifices that citizens make, and including in Estonia, they gave up, resurfacing roads at a time when to raise their defense spending. But that's not for me. Okay, Thomas, I'm going to take 3 in a row. So I will take. I can see you. Yes. Oh, yes. And Dan Fried, all my loves are holding up their hands. And I will take the journalist from Japan. Okay, so then that's going to be our first round, and we're going to try to get through it. We have 20 minutes, okay? Everybody be diligent. And disciplined, I mean.
Thank you very much.
Actually, I should take, out of protocol reasons, if I don't take Ylvis first. Okay, Thomas.
Why you create confusion?
Hi.
Thomas, now you...
I used to be president here. I'm going to ask a quick question.
Thank you.
In the last 24 hours, we saw the news about the pullback of the 4,000 from Poland, of which some are serving in Estonia. Also in the last 24 hours, Christopher Smith, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, said that as soon as the war in Ukraine is over, Moscow will seek to rebalance its forces and look for opportunities to project power and create dilemmas for NATO. Quote, this is particularly acute in the Baltic region.
Okay.
How do you reconcile those two statements or acts?
Are you speaking to any panelist in particular?
To the Undersecretary, please. But since they're two contradictory statements from the same government,
okay,
I don't
Tom
quite
Donato?
understand.
Okay.
I've already spoken to the force posture question, so I'm not going to address that. What was your second question, sir?
It was artist.
You asked about force posture and the second question. I didn't see Mr. Smith's statements. Yeah, well, that's always fun. I've done that myself. Look, I don't think it's any secret that Russia has 800,000 troops in Europe. And that's a problem. Again, I don't know what Mr. Smith says, so I can't react to it.
My question is, if on one hand, if we are the big problem, on the other hand, you're reducing troops that are here, I don't understand how that works.
You don't understand the logic of the troop reductions.
I've already addressed the troop reductions. I don't think I need to belabor it. It's clear that the United States was going to make some force posture adjustments. Those are military decisions made from the Pentagon, and of course, an 800,000 person army in Europe would be problematic for NATO. I don't think that's debatable. Again, can't speak to Mr. Smith's specifics.
Okay, introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Arts Pabriks, former Vice Prime Minister, Defense and Foreign Minister of Latvia. I don't like to be very much diverted with the discussion. We all understand that Europe didn't do enough job and they have to do it. But in this panel, at least me, I would like to hear something about the next chapter of Bridge Over Troubled Water. And my question follows also to probably distinguished Denina. Can we trust Americans because United States stopped supporting Ukraine? Europe pays for that. International criminal Putin was invited to United States for a visit. All the political relationship shows that United States currently favors Russia and disfavors Ukraine. Ukraine is arch enemy. Russia is arch enemy now of your allies in Europe. Can we here at the border with Russia still trust that from the first moment of hypothetical attack, you will be here, your troops will engage, and you will fight against Russians together with us? That is a question.
Thanks for. I think where you're going with this is, look, we've been in NATO for 7 decades. I don't think troop redeployments, again, understanding how sensitive they are to the region, is going to change 7 decades of partnership. And again, we've already spoken to, again, Boris, thanks for the comments about Russia. I've sat with the Russians. I've talked to them extensively. I think it's appropriate that the 2 largest nuclear powers on Earth keep channels and communications open. So I don't know anybody. I think that's a bad idea.
There might be some. Dan Fried? Dan, you have to ask somebody else on the panel.
Sorry?
That's okay. He can ask me.
Well,
That's what I'm here for.
No, okay. There were some. I'll call on you next.
All right. So, to Boris Ruga.
All right.
So, the Trump administration has won the argument on European defense spending. And NATO 3.0 could work. You said so, and I agree with that. So it's a big win. But the withdrawal of the rotational brigade has created concerns, and I think Tom DiNanno has heard them.
DiNanno.
DiNanno,
sorry.
Okay.
And I think he's heard them. The question for you, Boris, is, are you confident that NATO can make this transition to NATO 3.0, which is a solid achievement?
Mm-hmm.
And are you confident the United States will manage its troop presence in Europe, rotational and permanent, in a way that is less haphazard than this, which, I'm sorry, was clearly haphazard and even chaotic in appearance?
Do you want me to answer
I would
that?
like you to answer
Okay,
that.
thanks, Harry.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. So I can't say a whole lot to this US decision, but what I would highlight is that we're talking about rotational deployment. So it is not a withdrawal in that sense, right? Number one. Number two, I'm absolutely confident that there is a critical mass in European NATO that has understood what we need to do and that is stepping up, and the defense spending numbers prove it. And the deployment of a full German armored brigade in Lithuania, I think, would suggest that there is a change in mindset, and I could come up with a bunch of other examples. And I'm also confident that the US will be there for NATO, in part because the logic of NATO remains compelling. NATO is a two-way street. It's there to secure European security, but NATO also provides security to North America, the United States, and Canada. So it works both ways, and that is why I'm confident that, that this administration and the US Congress, supported by pretty significant numbers in US public opinion as well, will be there for NATO.
And the talk around NATO is that until you get down to the numbers pre-2022, people don't get too nervous. And we're not there yet, but in terms of US forces. Sure.
But I think when I remember what Elbridge Colby said on the record at the Munich Security Conference, and you can still find it actually on the ECFR website, when he was talking about NATO 3.0 and a European-led NATO, he was making pretty clear that this would mean less American troops and less American capabilities. And I think we need to be very clear about this.
Over time.
I mean, over time, but that this was about a bigger European contribution and a smaller US contribution. And I think there is no way around this. We need to accommodate this. And that means that we need to not only fill the gaps, which I think we absolutely need to do, but we also need to brace ourselves for an unmanaged transition. I mean, I would dream of a managed transition where we agree with the United States on timelines and stuff, but I think the last year has shown that this is somewhat unpredictable. So I think mentally we need to get ready for defending Europe with less American engagement.
But again, as Thomas said, this does not really come as a surprise, does it? For 20 years, US administrations have been talking about the pivot to Asia or the rebalancing. And a geopolitical fact is the rise of China, the buildup of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, its air force, its navy, its strategic rocket forces, at a pace and scale unseen at least since the end of World War II. So obviously, the United States of America has its work cut out in the Indo-Pacific to maintain a balance and to keep the peace in that part of the world, which is absolutely critical to European interests as well.
But I think what we hear people saying is, you could have given us a heads up. Don't just announce that it's a done deal, that it's, it's a fait accompli. Okay, I'm coming back to my question. There's my colleague there.
So Hiro Akita from Tokyo, another very dangerous part of the world. So my question is a specific war scenario. Mr. Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, warned the end of last year that within 5 years, there is a risk that Russia will attack NATO. But Russia is struggling only in Ukraine. But still, I believe that it is really a real threat that he warned about. So my question is, what is a specific war scenario that Russia will attack NATO within several years, if it is real?
And whom would you like to answer?
Rook?
Boris.
Boris?
I don't really want to spell out sort of war scenarios, but I think you're right in referring to Mark Rutte's speech. I think similar speeches have been given by other European leaders about the need to build our deterrence and defense in the face of a aggressive Russia that on a routine basis threatens NATO allies and also threatens to use its nuclear arsenal against NATO allies. And that is sort of the daily kind of fare that is served on Russian state-controlled TV. So I think we are well advised to build up our deterrence and defense, and I think we are making good progress in that regard. But I think Mark Rutte wanted to send a very clear message, and I think it was a message that has been received in many capitals, in most.
Okay, I have a question in the back there, one more, and then over here, and we're making good time. We have 7 minutes. Yes.
Riho Terras, member of European Parliament.
Former Estonian chief of military.
I see that everybody is hitting the Americans today. I want to say what I see in European Parliament or Europe. And that is that the feeling of urgency is not there. Spain, military spendings 1.2, Italy 1.5. So no changes whatsoever if you compare it what has been planned. And I was in the Wales summit where the first time the 2% hurdle has been announced, but the 2% was peacetime minimum spending. And now there are countries in Europe, the big countries. It doesn't matter how much Estonia spends, 4.5 point whatever, if Italy, Spain, France, UK are around 2%, we will not get the NATO we need to be competitive in the current defense world. And my question is, especially those who come from Germany, how you look in the eyes of a German chancellor if the Spanish prime minister does not do what the Germans do?
Okay, I'm going to take this question, and then I'm going to take Ben Hodges. And we'll try to get this to all of them.
My name is Roman Dobrokhotov. I'm editor-in-chief of The Insider. So when we speak about the defense of Europe, we mostly speak about government spending, but there's also problem of regulation, government regulation. So the main problem for Ukraine maybe now is not even money, but people. And there are only 2,000 foreign recruiters now fighting in Ukraine. And European and Western regulation does not allow volunteers to go to Ukraine to fight. It's actually a criminal offense. And we know examples in history. So in Spain during Civil War, there were 30,000 foreign recruiters. In Finland, there were 10,000 foreign recruiters when they defend themselves.
So is your question whether you want
even
governments
ISIS
to
recruited more? Even ISIS recruited more people in Europe than now Ukraine.
What's your question?
So the question is for all the European representatives. So isn't this a good time to change your regulation and to allow actually Europeans to go and defend Ukraine? It's insane.
I guess that would be to heads of state. Okay. Sorry, I had one.
Steve?
Here. No, yeah, Steve. I didn't call on Steve yet, but I have Ben was in
collect
the
all
back.
the questions. The time will be over.
I know. Okay, Steve and Ben, very quickly.
Just saying.
You can have this job next time, and I'm going to sit there. Okay. Steve Clemons, quickly.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I really like how Edi Rama has tried to de-silo the discussion a little bit. And by talking about Mario Draghi, in a way, and if you just sort of suspend, the frames we've had on the United States for a minute, to some degree, President Trump, in looking at the national security dimensions of the economic performance in the United States, is trying to synthesize these different features a lot more. And that's what I sort of felt you were trying to do with the Mario Draghi discussion and saying how core it is. If you go to some uncomfortable places...
30 seconds, Steve,
okay.
I'm serious.
Yes.
Okay.
If you go to China, something like this, there's a synthesis there. So I just wanted to sort of raise this question about how you see this conversation in Europe. Is it still a boutique conversation with Mario Draghi, or is it much bigger outside this room?
Okay, that's going to take up a lot of time. Ben Hodges?
I think that instead of finishing the time with questions, I have to answer.
But quickly.
I think that, look, at the end of this conversation, what we had, we are here to speak about, or we try to speak about how Europe should build up its defense and be self-sufficient, which everybody from at least European side said. But when it comes to what is in the background, the easiest thing is to hit the United States and to hit Trump. While our problem is not Trump, is not the United States, is not if they go around or they come around, because it is what it is, as Trump would say. But our problem is how Europe will become a force that will sustain this ramp up of its own military capability, while becoming, in the same time, the place that we all adored when we were behind the wall. So becoming the place of competitiveness, becoming the place of a real single market, becoming the place of not fragmented energy market, becoming the place where AI is not just regulated, but it's also created. And sorry, but becoming the place where we should not forget that what made Europe Europe was not the fact that Europe could go to war, but was also the fact that Europe was the most incredible soft power in the world.
That's a wonderful wrap-up sentence.
Diplomacy is also something
I have to let other
we should
people
do.
answer.
So Europe should talk to Vladimir Vladimirovich and not simply talk about Trump. And talking to Vladimir Vladimirovich is not easy, I know. It doesn't mean to not support Ukraine. It means to support Ukraine all the way, but also to understand that to honor Europe and European culture and history, we have to play it differently. And that's why I want to answer to the man. Yes, ISIS recruited more people, but Europe cannot copycat ISIS, because we should aim for something totally different. And this is the thing we are avoiding all the time. The gentleman there says Spain. Listen, Pedro Sanchez made a very good argument. He doesn't need me to advocate for him, but he made a very good argument that it's not about how much percent, it's about capabilities, and it's about how we make capabilities
that are European defense, not just Estonia defense or Albania defense or Britain defense, but European defense. And we are so far from it that we are all the time trying to get the answers on how Trump will become less passionate to confuse us. This will not happen.
Okay, thank you. I really have to let others. Okay, would you open up your? Would you change the rules on letting citizens fight for Ukraine?
Yeah, but they are probably.
Okay.
We have volunteers fighting there, but I will correct my friend Eddie because he's very, very passionate. But I would say the first thing, I agree on that the problem is Putin. That is a problem. That is a real problem. And the problem is European weakness. Europe was a project of peace without arms. Now it's becoming a project of peace with arms. That is a much needed change. That is the first thing with the industry and everything. But Europe should not ask for European security from Putin. This is not the right way. No, this is not the right way.
Why you applaud? This is obvious. I didn't say that. But sorry, but Israel and Hamas choked each other to death, and they talked all the time. What does it mean? I'm not. Don't forget, I come from a country where since 1960 no one went to Moscow and no one came from Moscow. So I'm far from being someone that would like to meet Vladimir Vladimirovich. But someone should, you know? Otherwise, what we do? We prepare what? Russia is there. It's not going to go anywhere else. So while we do everything was rightly said, diplomacy is a must. Why then 8 leaders go to Trump in front of him around the chair and they ask him, what you talk to Vladimir? What Vladimir said to you? Go direct.
You like movies. Yeah. There's a saying that you will have everything with a good word, but with a good word and revolver, you will have much more. So this is the way to deal with Russia.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's,
okay.
Yeah.
There was a question to the Germans, but it may have been more of a rhetorical question. How do you ask your own citizens to spend more? Now it's been already half an hour since
I would just like to say that the numbers that were quoted on Italy and Spain, I think, are wrong. They're wrong. They're not correct. Sorry, yeah. We received the reporting from allies, and our people check those numbers. So
I mean, there's more tracking now than ever on
exactly.
This.
And so there's a big.
We'll see more at the Hague.
Just to say, there's a very significant increase. And the point is, of course, in an alliance of 32 democracies, not everyone is going to do this at the same pace, but we have quite a few NATO allies who are ahead of the curve in delivering on the Hague Defense Investment Plan. That includes Germany, that includes Sweden, for example.
That includes Estonia.
And it, of course, includes Estonia. We've talked about Estonia a lot. So that's happening. I think the point made there was that Estonia doesn't matter because it's small. I don't think that's true. I think Estonia matters a lot.
Okay. Well, yeah.
It's not true. It's not true.
Well,
come on.
Okay, Ben, I'm sorry.
It's not true.
Ben Hodges, you're going to have the last word. Can you answer your own question and make it really quick?
Okay, my question is to Secretary Donato. Sir, today
this is really the last one.
The acting Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army testified in front of Congress that the decision to cancel the brigade combat team deployment to Poland was made just 2 weeks ago. So this is not exactly grand strategy. My question, sir, is why could you not say yes to this very simple question from our Latvian ally? It's the easiest yes answer you could have ever given. Yes, of course the United States will defend NATO if they're attacked. Why could you not say yes unless you don't believe it or if that's not the policy of the Trump administration?
Do you know General Hodges?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Former EUCOM commander.
Is there a question there?
Yeah, he wants to know why you couldn't say an unequivocal yes to will the United States be there when Artis asked you.
I just did. I said we've been here for 7 decades.
That's right.
Sorry, I'm the DCM of the Spanish Embassy. Thank you, Prime Minister, for supporting my president. I really think if you criticize another country, you have to get your figures right. And I don't think it's
well, this is
really
not our
helpful.
era in Europe.
I mean, my Estonian MP fellow really is incorrect. Our expenditure is 2.1%.
But you did say you wouldn't go to 5.
No, sorry. And it's respectful also for my Italian colleague whose F-35 just did the job against the Russian aircrafts. So I think that if we punch against each other, it doesn't help. We, as the Prime Minister said, we know exactly who is our threat, and I think it doesn't help what the Estonian Prime Minister has said, because it's not right. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate Rook declarations argument, because actually that is the way we have to follow. So thank you, Prime Minister, thank you both, and thank you, NATO, and please, before standing and criticizing your allies and your EU memberships, you have to get the figure right. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I said this was going to be a candid conversation. I didn't expect it to. Everybody's open.
Yeah. Well done.
Felt quite sporty, but everybody's worked up an appetite. It's dinner time. There are buses that will be taking people to dinner at 6:45, but most importantly, everyone come back at 10 o'clock. There's a night owl with booze where you can continue this conversation.
With booze.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, sounds right. That's the Estonian way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of money and I spent a lot of time. The trip we made to Hollywood is etched upon my mind. After all the things we've done and seen, you find another man. The things you think are useless, I can't understand. Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time? Are you gathering up the tears? Have you had enough of mine? Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time?